Good day to everyone. Welcome to Putting Our Mind of Christ, the inner work of Christianity. You are loved with an everlasting love. This is your Pastor Yeti. I hope all is well with all of you and ready to move forward with another chapter of the Kingdom of Heaven. Today I'm going to talk about mapping the path to the Kingdom of Heaven. The traditional Christian spiritual maps, beginning with the threefold map of Saint Dionysius, the early Christian saint who divided the Christian spiritual path into the purgative, illuminative, and unitive ways, are inadequate. These maps do not account for the evolution of human consciousness in children, adolescents, or even in the average Christian adult. The traditional maps, understandably, also fail to take into account the mapping of human consciousness growth by modern psychology. In place of the traditional maps, I propose a 9-stage map based upon the work of 20th century consciousness pioneers such as Jean Piaget, Jean Gersberg, and Ken Wilber. Throughout the centuries, various Christian authors have attempted to map the spiritual path to the inner vision of the Kingdom of Heaven. The map makers necessarily had to base the maps they drew on their own experience. And since they generally did not realize that different human beings begin the spiritual path at different levels of awareness, the map makers generally assumed that their experience could be duplicated by others. The most traditional of these Christian maps was drawn by Saint Dionysius about 500 AD. Saint Dionysius, actually a pseudonym for an author whose real name is unknown. Following an even earlier tradition mentioned by Saint Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century, divides the path into 3 stages of inner growth: purgative, purification from the grossest form of egotism and selfishness; illuminative, the breaking in upon the person of greater spiritual insights and understandings; and unitive, union with God. Saint Dionysius, however, proposed a second 5-step map based upon what he saw as the 5 levels of prayer: vocal prayer, mental prayer, the prayer of recollection, the prayer of quiet beyond thought, and the prayer of union with God. The anonymous author of the 14th century Christian classic, The Cloud of Unknowing, wrote that Christian spiritual development seems to progress through 4 ascending phases of growth, which I call the common, the special, the singular, and the perfect. The 16th century Saint Teresa of Avila, in her masterpiece, The Interior Castle, divided the path into 7 stages of consciousness or mentions. Her friend and contemporary St. John of the Cross divided the path into 5 stages: that of the beginning, contemplative, the dark night of the senses, an intervening period of progressive spiritual illuminations, the dark night of the soul, and finally, union with God. The English Anglican Evelyn Underhill, early in the 20th century, roughly followed John's 5 stages, but began at an earlier point on the path than he, with what she called the awakening of the transcendental consciousness in a conversion experience. There have been many other attempts at mapping with any number of different stages. And there are 2 basic problems with these traditional maps to the kingdom of heaven. First, all of them have been partial mapping only portions of the spiritual path. For example, they have generally ignored the growth of consciousness in children, adolescents, and sometimes in the ordinary Christian adult. With respect to adults, the map makers have assumed that all Christians, or at least all religiously dedicated Christians, begin the path at more or less the same level of consciousness as themselves, and so can be expected to duplicate the map maker's experience. St. John of the Cross, for example, begins his account of the spiritual path at the level he calls the beginning contemplative, a stage already well past the place in consciousness where most Christians dwell. Evelyn Underhill starts earlier than John, but admits that her beginning conversion experience usually happens to people who are already deeply religious and is well above the level of the normal evangelical conversion experience of being born again. Saint Teresa's account begins at about the same high level as John's. The American Catholic laywoman Bernadette Roberts starts her account, which admittedly is only an attempt to describe her individual journey, at an even higher level. She begins with the dark night of the soul. Meister Eckhart talks about only the 2 highest levels: union with God and non-dual identity with God. And second, the older maps obviously could not take into account the huge amount of scholarship that has been done by the modern developmental psychology in mapping the levels of growth in human consciousness from infancy to highly functioning adulthood. Thanks almost single-handedly to the work of Ken Wilber, these 2 problems in mapping the spiritual path have been substantially addressed in recent years. Wilber has done a massive amount of study of both developmental psychology and the traditional spiritual writings of both East and West. In his recent works, which are written in a predominantly scholarly vein, he has presented an overall outline of the spiritual path from start to finish, as well as many of its detail. The fundamental structures of human consciousness do not vary from one historical period to another. The stages through which human consciousness progresses to what Christians call union with God, and afterwards the inner non-dual vision of the kingdom of heaven here on earth, are the same now as they were for the early Christians. In philosophical terms, this never-changing structure of human consciousness development has been called the Perennial Philosophy. For that reason, it is indeed perennial or unchanging. Nor do the basic structures of human consciousness growth, which are universal, vary from the West to East. Human beings are the same everywhere. The same 9 stages and structures, as Wilbur demonstrated, are to be found. For example, in the Roman philosopher, mystic, and spiritual master Plotinus, a teacher for St. Augustine and many church fathers, as in the Buddhist philosopher, mystic, and spiritual master Nigarjuna. Wilbur bases his classification of the levels of human consciousness on the work of both psychologists and mystics, both Christians and non-Christians, with contributions from philosophy and other disciplines. He divides the spiritual path into 9 stages, each corresponding to a separate level of consciousness. He says that earth of these levels could be broken into sub-stages. He says that that each of these levels could be broken into sub-stages. But for the purpose of his books, and as we now going through this study, 9 stages will do. Wilbur warns that the 9 stages are not to be understood as neat little boxes. First, the levels of consciousness can overlap to some extent. For example, one level can begin before another has completely finished. Though, in my experience, the break between levels is often noticeable and discreet. The second, beginning with the development of the human mind, we can repress parts of our consciousness that we don't like, usually sexual and aggressive feelings. And these parts of ourselves can remain stuck at the lower levels where they drain our energy so much that they, unless cleared up later, can prevent our advance to the highest spiritual levels. Third, a person can pass to the next grade of consciousness without full mastery of the grade below. Only basis, competence, at one level of consciousness is normally required before going to the next level. Fourth, things can go wrong at every level, beginning with psychosis, the worst form of mental illness, at the first level. And generally, the earlier things go wrong, the more time and trouble it takes to remedy the situation later. And finally, as Jesus pointed out, the path can get difficult, misunderstood, and controversial the further once one consciousness begins to go beyond the level realized by one's family, community, co-religionists, and culture. You can read the scripture that I now will give you, Luke 14, verse 26. His experience on the cross shows this. In the following broadcast of the Putting on the Mind of Christ, I will make substantial use of Wilber's groundbreaking work. I hope this will help to give his map of the spiritual path a wider audience, though I would have preferred a different name for at least one of the levels. I will use Wilber's terminology for the 9 levels, which he himself took in part from the German-Swiss philosopher Jean Gebser. Gebser finished a monumental comparative study of civilization, Ursprung und Gegenwart, in 1953. His book, which describes the consciousness of various historical eras and cultures, was published in England in 1985 by Ohio University, the Ohio University Press, under the title The Ever-Present Origin. I am adopting Wilber Gebser terminology because I believe that one of the most serious obstacles to explaining and mapping the spiritual path is that spiritual terminology has been and largely remain a Tower of Babel throughout the world. Genesis 11, verses 1 to 9. I have no wise to contribute further to the confusion. In addition to describing the development of individual consciousness from the consciousness of the infant to the highest mystical state, Wilber discusses the historical development of consciousness by the human race. Using the work of Gebser and the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, among others, Wilber asserts that the human race as a whole has already passed through 3 levels of consciousness: the archaic, the magical, and the mythical. But we're gonna go there. And is now into the 4th level of consciousness, the rational. Wilber observes that people at each level of consciousness actually see the world, this world, differently, and what they see determines the type of culture, laws, and institutions they create with their particular worldview. When the mass of humanity, or even merely the dominant leaderships, moves to a higher level of consciousness, practically everything changes in the surrounding culture, as the old forms and institutions crumble and new forms attempt to take their place. This is what has been happening for the last century at an ever accelerating pace. I will make use of this aspect of Wilber's work to show how the Judeo-Christian tradition has been influenced and has played in part in various cultural shifts in consciousness. I will also at times make observations about what I believe the future may hold, both for human culture in general and for Christians spiritually in particular. Anonymous, The Cloud of Unknowing, edited by William Johnstone, Doubleday, New York, 1973, 1996. And on that particular page 45, emphasizes in original. Evelyn Underhill, 1910, 1990, in Mysticism, Doubleday, New York, page 176. And here I reserve the term spiritual master for persons of non-Christian traditions who have realized either the causal, or the ninth non-dual levels of human consciousness. And I will go there later. In Christianity, it is inappropriate to talk of any master except Jesus. Jürgen Habermas, 1929, is a German philosopher associated with the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. His books include Knowledge and Human Interest, Moral Consciousness, and Communicative Action, and the Theory of Communication Actions. So, we have to do it with this for today. If we look at ourselves as the path we walk, then if we don't use all these words I just mentioned, all those philosopher words, and you will notify that at least if there is some consciousness, that you see that your life is developing and moving in another direction, sometimes on a higher level, and sometimes the status quo. Well, I will encourage you that it's fine, because it is you and the walk with Christ. That's your path. And how you do it, I hope that I can encourage you what you hear, and some methods that I will present will help you to go in that deeper inner path and mind of Christ. I wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are on this globe. May the light of Christ that shines in you shines through this world, where healing takes place, will forces destroyed, and where you and me touch other people to find healing and encouragement. May we all come to that level, putting on the mind of Christ on a very much deeper level, and grow with the help of the Holy Spirit. May God bless you and protect you. May His light shine upon you and hold you close to His heart. This is your Pastor Yeti. Bye-bye.